My name is Carolyn Hazel Drake, and this is my studio. This studio was not always the gorgeous space you see in front of you today. About a year ago, my then fiance, now husband, and I decided to tackle what was a dire and decrepit state of affairs, a single-car detached garage that was on the verge of collapse. And we reimagined it, stripped it to the studs, and built it out as a place that could function as my studio. I was able to move in just a couple of weeks before we married, and it was incredibly affirming to have a space for my artist to move onto the property. When I come into the studio, I have routines and rituals that I try to follow. In addition to being an artist, I have always worked full-time in arts education, so my time in the studio is precious. And these rituals help me to get grounded and to remind myself to take my practice seriously. So I put on a record, I light some incense to mark the special and sacred nature of this time. I sign in to keep track of how many hours I spend in the studio, and then you gotta have a cup of tea. For most of my adult life, my studio was a designated corner of the living room. When I was raising my daughter, it wasn't feasible to have a studio space outside of my home or apartment, and so I learned to be very organized. I try and stay that way. For me, there's always a moment when I feel settled and grounded, where I have the decision to make. What will I focus on today? And often what I turn to is reading and writing. Reading and writing helps me to make the connections that would otherwise maybe stay adrift, and to help me understand what I'm trying to manifest in my art. Right now I'm reading a book by Taube Auerbach. It's called SZ, and she's a brilliant artist working with text and language and symbol and systems, and I'm just totally intoxicated by the graphic nature of her art. I work usually with domestic materials, clay and textiles. You can see some of my ceramic works on the windowsill there. With textiles, I use hand-dyed wools and cottons, and there's a lot of repetition, a lot of use of repeated shapes in my compositions. And with shape, there's the positive space, there's the shape that you're cutting out, but there's also the evocative negative space, the shards or edges that are left behind that are an echo of that shape. And I find them very compelling, and these edges find their way into my compositions all the time. Tools of the trade. Some of my favorites, these are sashiko threads from Japan. They're dyed with mulberry leaves and bark. These are some of my favorite chenille needles. They're from my sister's web shop, Handcraft, where I get some of my favorite notions. This is Valdani pearl cotton, and it's got the most gorgeous luster and variegation, and it's just a delight to sew with. Tiny containers to put even tinier things in. There's not much better than that. This is a little pencil case that I got on a trip to Seoul, South Korea with my daughter, and this is my tool du jour. Looks like a tiny pen, but it's actually got a little blade that pops in and out of the end. And then a ruler. This I got from an estate sale many years ago. These tools give me so much pleasure. Right now I'm working on a burial shroud for a show I have coming up in July. It's a burial shroud for the year 2020, and it features a repeated motif of the jonquil or daffodil, the flower of March. For myself, and I think for many others, this year has felt like March ad nauseum, and here we are now a year later with spring upon us again, and this feeling of rebirth and renewal that's coupled with a real sense of collective grief and loss at the many people that have died because of COVID. And this juxtaposition, this dissonance from the two feelings, the sense of personal joy I have being a season of joy in my life of being married, coupled with that sense of loss and grief. At the end of the day, sometimes tidying up it gives you a sense of accomplishment that you might not otherwise feel. This is a glimpse into an afternoon in my studio. Thank you so much for joining me today.